I wanted to see if I could automate virtual machine deployments. I've set a few rules. No pressure. All right, our first workflow ran successfully, but now we need to create another workflow that's going to deploy multiple virtual machines. Let's get started. All right, let's close out of our first workflow, and what we're going to do next is we're going to create a second workflow. Once again, we'll do so by going to New Workflow, and I'm going to call my workflow Create Multiple VMs. We'll click Create, and again, there are various settings that we could set here, but I always type a description for every workflow I create. But what we're going to do is jump to the Schema tab once again. So this new workflow has a basically empty schema. All it has is a start and an end schema element. But what we're going to do is we are going to drag in a, workflow element, just like we did before. But this time, we're not going to call that other workflow called Create Simple Virtual Machine. Despite its name, Create Simple Virtual Machine, it wants a dozen or so different inputs. Instead, what we're going to do is call the workflow that we just created, which I believe was called Create One Virtual Machine. There it is. So by calling this workflow, just like any other workflow, I'm going to have to provide any inputs that it requires along with any outputs that it sends back. This particular workflow that we defined has no outputs, but it does require one input. So this input is the input for this other workflow. What we're going to do over here is to create either an input or an output or a variable for our workflow. Now, if we wanted to, we could say create new. We could say make it an input to give the user control. And we could say that this one is going to be a string and instead make it an array of strings, but we're going to take a different approach here. Instead of letting the user pick the names, and I don't know about you, but I don't trust my users to pick names for virtual machines. If I let the users pick the names for the virtual machines, they're going to pick some wacko name that's not in compliance with our corporate naming scheme. So instead of giving the user control by creating an input, let's create a variable. Now, as always, I'm going to type a description for this variable. Now, again, I could potentially set a value here and pre-hardcode that value. Sometimes you'll do that with variables, but in this instance, I'm intentionally not setting a value for this variable because the workflow is going to set the value. Let's go ahead and create that new variable. Now, you might be thinking to yourself right now, why did Brian create a variable called virtual machine name when obviously we're going to need to know multiple virtual machine names because we're creating multiple virtual machines? Well, here's what's going to happen. We are going to create multiple virtual machines. They're each going to have their own unique name. And again, the names are going to follow a naming scheme. The names are going to be myVM-0000, and it'll be a 4-digit number, and the final number will continue to increment for each new virtual machine. Okay, we've started our second workflow, but we're going to need to write some code to generate VM names. Join me in the next video, and I'll show you how.